A 6-year-old girl timidly enters a bakery and approaches the counter, clutching some dirty coins. With a trembling voice filled with shame and hope, she whispers to the baker, "Sir, today is my birthday. Can I just blow out a candle and make a wish? I don't have money to buy cake, but I promise not to bother anyone." What she doesn't know is that an elegant millionaire sitting at a nearby table then stands up and does something that shocks everyone. The Chicago winter morning cut skin like invisible razors, and the breath of passers-by formed small, ghostly clouds in the downtown streets. Edward Miles adjusted his Italian wool coat as he walked toward the Sweet Haven Bakery, his Italian leather shoes echoing on the wet pavement. At 42, he carried the weight of a business empire built with steely determination and personal sacrifices that had molded him into a solitary, calculating man. The meeting with the Japanese investors was scheduled for 10, and Edward had a habit of arriving early for important appointments. The bakery, its windows fogged by the contrast between the biting cold outside and the cozy warmth within, seemed the perfect refuge to review the documents one last time. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla flooded his senses as he pushed open the glass door, triggering the small bell that announced a customer's arrival. He chose a table near the window where he could watch the street's rhythm while he waited. The establishment was nearly empty at this early hour, save for a few office workers grabbing a quick coffee before facing another workday. Edward opened his leather briefcase and spread the papers across the table, his eyes scanning numbers that represented millions in potential profit. That's when she walked in. The little girl appeared in the doorway like a fragile apparition, her brown hair tousled by the cold wind, and her clothes, though clean, visibly mended and far too large for her small frame. She couldn't have been more than 6, but her brown eyes held a disturbing maturity, as if she had lived through experiences no child should ever know. For a moment, she hesitated at the entrance, surveying the room with the caution of a small, wild animal assessing unknown territory. Edward noticed how her small fingers clutched a few coins with an almost desperate force, and how she took a deep breath before approaching the counter. There was something in her posture that intrigued him, a quiet resolve that contrasted with her apparent vulnerability without realizing it. He lowered his documents and focused his attention on the scene unfolding a few feet away. The baker, a portly, middle-aged man with flour-stained aprons, barely looked up as the girl approached. She had to stand on her tiptoes to rest her elbows on the marble countertop, and her voice came out so soft that Edward had to strain to hear, "Sir, today's my birthday," she whispered, a touching vulnerability in how she pronounced each word. "Can I just blow out a candle and make a wish? I don't have money to buy a cake, but I promise I won't be any trouble." The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He watched the baker's expression shift, annoyance replacing his initial indifference. The man sighed with impatience, his eyes scanning the child's humble appearance with obvious disdain. "Kid, this is a place of business, not a charity," the baker said, his harsh voice cutting through the warm air of the bakery. "If you don't have money to buy something, you can't be in here bothering the paying customers." Edward felt something shatter inside his chest as he saw disappointment spread across the little girl's face. The coins trembled in her small hands, and she lowered her head as if she'd just been physically struck. For a moment that felt like an eternity, silence hung over the bakery like a storm cloud, and it was in that moment that Edward Miles made a decision that would change his life forever. He rose from his table, put his meeting documents away, and walked toward the counter, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. Something inside him had awakened, and there was no turning back. "I'd like a whole strawberry cake," Edward said, his firm voice cutting through the tense silence, "and I need it prepared immediately." The baker blinked several times, clearly confused by the unexpected interruption. The little girl turned slowly, her eyes wide with surprise as she saw the elegant man who had been sitting at the nearby table. Edward could feel his heart hammering in his chest as he watched the look of astonishment on the child's face. "Sir, the whole cake?" the baker asked, his attitude instantly shifting to the deference he reserved for well-dressed clients. "How many slices would you like me to cut?" Edward looked directly at the girl, who remained as still as a statue, clutching her coins so tightly her knuckles had turned white. There was something in the way she watched him, a mixture of hope and distrust that touched him deeply. "The whole cake," he repeated, keeping his gaze fixed on the child. "And an extra plate, please." The atmosphere in the bakery seemed to have transformed completely. The few customers present had stopped talking and were watching the scene with poorly concealed curiosity. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine as he crouched down to the girl's level, approaching her with the same caution he would use with a wounded animal. "Let's eat together," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. "This cake is your birthday present." The girl's reaction was immediate and devastating. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stared at him with an intensity Edward had never experienced, as if trying to decipher whether this was real or just another cruelty disguised as kindness. Are you serious, mister?" she asked, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear. "Completely serious," Edward replied, extending a hand toward her. "What's your name?" "Lily," she whispered, looking at his outstretched hand as if it were a magical object. "My name's Lily." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Lily. I'm Edward." He kept his hand extended, waiting patiently for her to decide whether to trust him. "And you said today is your birthday." Lily nodded shyly, finally touching his hand with her small, cold fingers. Edward was shocked by how cold her skin was, and noticed she was trembling slightly, not just from the cold, but from an emotion he couldn't quite identify. The baker, now completely subservient, brought a magnificently decorated strawberry cake, with white frosting and fresh strawberries artfully arranged across its surface. It was the kind of cake that cost the equivalent of several meals for an average family, but Edward didn't even think about the price. "How old are you turning?" he asked as the baker placed a single candle in the center of the cake. "6, Lily answered, her eyes fixed on the cake as if she were looking at a priceless treasure. When the candle was lit, the small flame danced in the reflection of her eyes, creating an image Edward knew he would never forget. Lily closed her eyes, clasped her small hands together, and made a silent wish before blowing out the candle with all her might. "What did you wish for?" Edward asked, genuinely curious. Lily looked at him seriously. "Grandma always says if you tell your wish, it won't come true," she said, but then added in a whisper, "But I wished I wouldn't be hungry anymore. And for Grandma to get better." The words struck Edward like lightning. He realized he had stumbled upon a reality his privileged life had conveniently kept at a distance. This child wasn't just having a tough time, she was living a daily struggle for survival. "Tell me about your grandma," he said, cutting a generous slice of cake and placing it on her plate. Lily's eyes lit up as she took the first bite. Edward had never seen anyone savor food with such pure gratitude and pleasure. She chewed slowly, as if she wanted every moment to last forever. "Grandma's real sick," she said between bites. "She coughs a lot and can't work anymore. I try to help by selling flowers on the street, but sometimes it's hard." She stopped eating and looked at him with an expression that mixed shame and determination. Can I take a piece to her? She hasn't had anything sweet in so long." Edward felt his throat tighten. "Lily," he said, his voice slightly hoarse, "the whole cake is yours. You can take as much as you want to your grandma." Tears finally streamed down the girl's face, and she covered it with her small hands. Edward instinctively reached out, gently touching her thin shoulder. In that moment, he knew his life had irrevocably changed, though he didn't yet fully understand what that would mean. Edward glanced at his Swiss watch and saw it was already 9:45. The meeting with the Japanese investors would start in 15 minutes, but for the first time in his career, he didn't feel the familiar urgency that always gripped him before major negotiations. Lily continued to savor the cake with a reverence that turned each bite into a sacred ritual. "Lily, I have to go to a meeting," he said, hesitating, "but could you wait for me here?" "It shouldn't take too long." The girl stopped eating and looked at him with an expression that mixed panic and resignation. "You're not coming back, are you?" she asked, her voice laden with a sadness that seemed disproportionate for her age. "Everyone always leaves." The words pierced Edward like shards of glass. He realized that for this child, disappointment was a constant companion, and that his offer of kindness probably seemed too good to be true. "But I will come back," he said, and the conviction in his own voice surprised him. "I promise I'll come back, and you can take the cake to your grandma while I'm gone." Lily nodded slowly, but Edward could see the doubt in her eyes. He stood up, paid the bill generously, and left the bakery with a heavy heart, carrying an unease he couldn't name. The meeting took place in Edward's office on the 15th floor of a corporate skyscraper that dominated the city's skyline. The Japanese investors, serious men in impeccable suits, presented their proposals with the precision of well-oiled machines. The numbers danced on the projector screen: millions in investments, profit percentages, growth projections that would make any businessman salivate with ambition. But Edward couldn't concentrate. His mind kept returning to the image of Lily clutching her dirty coins, to the tremor in her voice when she made her humble request, to the way her eyes lit up when she tasted the cake. He found himself wondering if she had really left or if she was still at the bakery, waiting against all odds for him to keep his promise. "Mr. Miles," said the leader of the Japanese delegation, noticing his distraction, "do you have any concerns with our proposal?" Edward blinked, forcing himself back to the present. No, my apologies. Please, continue." But the more the meeting progressed, the more he felt a growing urgency to return to the bakery. There was something in Lily's pure innocence that had touched a part of his soul he thought he had lost long ago. Amid discussions of profit margins and market strategies, he remembered the last time he had felt a genuine human connection. The meeting stretched on longer than planned. When it finally ended, it was already past noon. Edward bid farewell to the investors with his usual professional courtesy, but his mind was already elsewhere. He practically ran to the elevator, his anxiety growing with each descending floor. When he reached the bakery, his heart leapt into his throat. Lily was not there. The establishment had returned to the normal lunchtime rush, filled with office workers and casual shoppers. Edward searched for her in every corner, asked the baker if she had left a message, but got no satisfactory answer. "She left right after you did," the baker said with indifference, took the cake in a box and was gone. Edward left the bakery with a sense of emptiness he hadn't experienced in years. He walked the downtown streets looking for Lily, scanning every corner, every shop entrance, every park bench. He didn't even know where she lived, had no information about her other than her first name and the mention of her sick grandmother. It was when he approached his car, a black Mercedes-Benz parked in front of the building where the meeting had been, that he saw her. Lily was sitting on the ground next to the vehicle, her clothes now dirty and torn, her face swollen and showing clear signs that she had been crying hard. "Lily!" he exclaimed, running toward her. "What happened? Are you hurt?" The girl looked up at him, and Edward saw a mixture of physical pain and wounded pride in her expression. Her shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was a scratch on her left arm, and her hair was even more disheveled than it had been that morning. "Mister," she said, her voice choked but firm, "some big kids tried to take your car. I saw them messing with the door and I yelled at them to stop." She stood up slowly, clearly in pain. "They hit me, but I fought to protect it. I couldn't let them steal the car from someone who was nice to me." Edward was in absolute shock. This 6-year-old child, who barely had the strength to carry the cake he had given her, had faced down older kids to protect a stranger's property. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he examined her injuries. "Lily, you didn't have to do that," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You could have been hurt much worse." "But you were nice to me," she replied with devastating simplicity. "Nobody's ever been that nice to me. I had to protect it." In that moment, Edward Miles knew his life had changed forever. This brave, pure child had risked her safety out of gratitude, and he couldn't just turn his back on her. He had to find out more about her story, her situation, about how he could truly help her. Edward insisted on taking Lily to a doctor, but she refused with a vehemence that surprised him. "I can't, mister," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "Grandma's waiting for the cake, and if I'm late, she'll get worried." "Then let me take you home," Edward proposed. "I want to meet your grandmother and make sure you get there safely." Lily hesitated, biting her lower lip nervously. "Our home. It's not nice like rich people's houses," she said finally. "You might not like it." "That doesn't matter," Edward answered sincerely. "What matters is that you're safe." They walked together through the downtown streets, Edward adjusting his stride to match the girl's short legs. As they moved away from the commercial district, the buildings grew smaller and more dilapidated, the streets narrower and more potholed. Edward had lived in this city his entire life, but he had never explored these forgotten areas where people fought a daily battle for survival. Lily led him through a maze of alleys and side streets, past small shops with weathered storefronts and row houses that seemed to defy gravity. The smell of home cooking mixed with that of sewage and smoke, creating an atmosphere that was both familiar and alien to Edward. "It's here," Lily said, stopping in front of a structure that could barely be called a house. It was little more than a ramshackle building of wood and corrugated metal, with patched walls and a roof that showed clear signs of leaking. A faded curtain served as a door, and there was no glass in the windows, only openings covered with scraps of fabric. Edward felt his stomach clench. He had imagined Lily's situation was difficult, but he wasn't prepared to see such extreme poverty so starkly and immediately. How was it possible that in a city where he owned a business empire, people were living in such precarious conditions? "Grandma!" Lily called out, pushing the curtain aside. "I brought a surprise." From the dark interior of the shack came a weak voice, broken by coughing. "Lily, my girl, you took so long, I was so worried." Edward followed Lily inside and needed a few seconds for his eyes to adjust to the dimness. The interior was even more shocking than the outside. The space was tiny, with makeshift furniture made from crates and a single bed that took up nearly half the room. On the bed lay a woman who looked much older than she probably was, her face etched with sickness and hardship. "Grandma, this is Edward," Lily said, her voice full of pride. "He gave me a whole birthday cake, and I brought a big piece for you." Lily's grandmother tried to sit up, but was overcome by a violent coughing fit that shook her entire frail body. Edward noticed she spat blood into a cloth she kept close by, and that her eyes had a feverish glint that indicated a serious infection. "A pleasure to meet you, Mom," Edward said, approaching the bed respectfully. "Rose," she answered with difficulty, between coughs. "I'm sorry I can't welcome you properly, sir. Our home is humble, but my Lily has a good heart." Edward watched Lily carefully open the cake box, her movements as delicate as if she were handling something sacred. She cut a small piece and offered it to her grandmother, who accepted it with tears in her eyes. "My goodness," Rose whispered after tasting the cake. "It's been so long since I tasted anything so good. Edward, you've been so generous to our girl." While the grandmother savored the cake, Edward took the opportunity to observe the environment more closely. There was no refrigerator, just a small styrofoam cooler. The stove was a makeshift hot plate, and the light came from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. In a corner was a small pile of medicines. many of them expired or half-used. "Rose," Edward said carefully, "you're not well. When was the last time you saw a doctor?" The woman laughed bitterly, a sound that was cut short by another coughing fit. "Doctors are for people with money, sir. I take some medicine I can afford from the pharmacy when Lily manages to get a few dollars. But it's not enough. Grandma worked her whole life cleaning houses," Lily explained, sitting beside the bed, "but now she can't anymore, so I sell flowers on the street to buy food and medicine." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. "Lily, you should be in school, not working." "I really want to go to school," she said, her eyes filling with dreams. "Grandma taught me my letters, but I've never been to a real school." "We don't have the papers," Rose explained, her voice growing weaker. "When Lily's mother died, in childbirth, we couldn't get the paperwork done right. Without a birth certificate, you can't enroll her in school." Edward fell silent, processing the magnitude of the situation. Lily wasn't just a poor child, she was invisible to the system, a person who officially didn't exist, without documentation. She couldn't access basic services, education, healthcare. She was condemned to live on the margins of society. "How long have you been like this?" Edward asked, referring to Rose's illness. "A few months," she replied. "It's getting worse. I know I won't get better without proper treatment, but..." She looked at Lily with an expression of pain that went beyond the physical. "Tutis, my worry is what will happen to Lily when I'm no longer here." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Edward realized he had stumbled into a developing tragedy, a situation that would become desperate in a matter of weeks if nothing was done. "I'm going to help," he said, surprising himself with his own determination. "I'm going to find a way to help you both." Rose looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and skepticism. "You're very kind, sir, but our situation is complicated. We have no papers, no money, no family. We're invisible to the world." But Edward had already made up his mind. This brave child who had risked her safety to protect a stranger, this loving grandmother who fought against death to care for her granddaughter, they would not be invisible to him. He would find a way to change their fate, even if it meant confronting a system that seemed designed to keep them on the fringe. In the days following the encounter at the bakery, Edward couldn't get Lily and Rose out of his mind. During business meetings, his thoughts would drift to the precarious shack where a 6-year-old girl shouldered responsibilities that many adults couldn't bear. He had promised to help, but discovered that turning goodwill into concrete action was more complex than he had imagined. His first attempt was to find a private doctor to examine Rose. Dr. Henry Morgan, his family doctor for years, agreed to make a house call for a generous fee. When Edward led him to the shack, the doctor's reaction was immediate and concerning. "This woman has advanced pneumonia," the doctor said after examining Rose. "Possibly tuberculosis. She needs to be hospitalized immediately for intensive treatment." He paused, taking in the living conditions. "Edward, to be blunt, she should have sought medical help months ago. Her condition is critical. Then let's get her to a hospital," Edward replied without hesitation. "It's not that simple," Dr. Morgan explained. "She has no ID, no insurance. Private hospitals will demand payment up front and proper documentation, and the public ones, well, without the right papers, it will be a long, bureaucratic process." Edward felt the first wave of frustration. He had enough money to pay for any treatment, but he was discovering that bureaucracy could be a more solid barrier than financial poverty. As he tried to resolve Rose's medical situation, Edward also began to face unexpected reactions in his own life. Megan, his younger sister and only close relative, appeared in his office one Thursday afternoon with an expression he knew well, the same one she wore as a child when she wanted something. "Edward, I need to talk to you," she said, sitting in the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. Megan had inherited the family's determination, but directed all her energy toward maintaining and growing the family fortune. At 38, she was an elegant, calculating woman who viewed relationships as investments. "What is it, Megan?" Edward asked, though he suspected the topic. "I've heard you've been getting involved in an irregular situation," she said, choosing her words carefully. "A street kid, is that right?" Edward stiffened. "How did you know?" "This city isn't that big, Edward. People talk. A businessman of your caliber seen in the slums, bringing private doctors to treat vagrants." She shook her head in disapproval. "Have you thought about the optics?" "I don't care about the optics," Edward replied, a rising irritation in his voice. "Well, you should," Megan said, her tone hardening. "But we have a business to protect, a reputation to maintain, and frankly, Edward, this is very strange. A 40-year-old single man taking an interest in a poor child. People will draw conclusions." Megan's words hit him like a slap. "How dare you imply that?" "I'm not implying anything," she said, raising her hands in false innocence. "But other people will. And when the rumors start, our entire family will suffer the consequences." Edward stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. Below, people went about their normal lives, oblivious to the silent tragedies unfolding just a few miles away. "Megan, there is a child who needs help," he said, keeping his voice controlled. "A brave, pure child who taught me more about dignity in one day than I've learned in years of business." "How romantic," Megan retorted with sarcasm. "Edward, you can help dozens of children by donating to charities, discreetly, without exposing yourself. Why this fixation on one specific child?" The question echoed in Edward's mind long after Megan had left. Why had Lily touched his heart so deeply? He tried to analyze his feelings rationally, but found that the connection he felt with the girl transcended logic. His efforts to help Lily intensified in the following days. He hired a lawyer specializing in documentation to try to regularize the girl's legal status, but discovered that without a mother's birth certificate or any supporting documents, the process would be extremely complex and time-consuming. At the same time, he began visiting Lily regularly, bringing food, medicine, and small gifts. The girl greeted his visits with a pure joy that warmed his heart. But Edward noticed she was taking on even more responsibilities as Rose's condition deteriorated. "Mr. Ed," Lily said one afternoon when he found her washing clothes in a makeshift basin in the yard, "I sold 3 bouquets of flowers today. I bought bread and some cough medicine for Grandma." Edward looked at her small hands, red and raw from the work, and felt a growing anger at a world that allowed a 6-year-old to carry such burdens. "Lily, where do you get the flowers?" he asked. "From an abandoned lot on the other side of town," she replied. "I wake up real early and go get them. Sometimes people don't like it and chase me away, but when I get some, I make little bouquets and sell them on the street." The image of Lily walking alone through the city before dawn, facing hostile adults to get a few flowers to sell, made Edward clench his fists. "What if I gave you money so you two wouldn't have to worry about that?" he suggested. Lily stopped washing and looked at him seriously. "Grandma always says we can't take handouts. If you want to help, that's okay, but it has to be in a way we deserve it." The girl's dignity both humbled and inspired him. Even in extreme need, she held onto principles that many privileged adults had long since lost. That night, Edward returned to his luxurious penthouse with a heavy heart. He had underestimated the complexity of helping someone who existed on the margins of the system. Every attempted solution hit a new bureaucratic, social, or legal roadblock. But one thing had become crystal clear in his mind. He would not give up on Lily, no matter how difficult it was, no matter how much his family protested, no matter how society judged his motives. He would find a way to give this extraordinary child the life she deserved. A week after the meeting at the bakery, Edward received a call that would drastically change the course of his efforts to help Lily. It was from Dr. Henry Morgan, and the doctor's worried tone made his stomach clench. "Edward, I need to speak with you urgently about the patient you asked me to examine," the doctor said. "I had a very strange visit today." "What kind of visit?" Edward asked. already dreading the answer. Social workers, from Child Protective Services, they wanted details about the child and her grandmother, claiming they'd received an anonymous tip about child neglect. They asked a lot of questions about you, too. The blood ran cold in Edward's veins. What did you tell them? What I could. That the child was being well cared for by her grandmother, within the limits of their situation. But Edward, they seem to have specific information about your meetings with the girl. Someone is watching and reporting your actions. After hanging up, Edward sat motionless in his executive chair, processing the implications. Someone had deliberately alerted the authorities about his relationship with Lily, and he had a strong suspicion who it might be. His suspicions were confirmed when Megan appeared in his office late that afternoon, this time accompanied by Robert Shaw, the family's lawyer for over 20 years. "Edward, we need to talk," Megan said, her expression more serious than he had ever seen it. "Robert has some legal concerns about your current situation." The lawyer, a portly man in his 60s known for his pragmatic approach, got straight to the point. "Edward, your sister told me about your involvement with a vulnerable child. From a legal standpoint, this could be extremely problematic." "Problematic how?" Edward asked, his voice colder than he intended. "A single man, no children, developing a sudden, intense interest in a poor, undocumented child. Edward, you have to understand how this can be interpreted," Robert explained. "We live in an age where any adult-child interaction is viewed with suspicion." "I'm just trying to help," Edward said, but he could hear the defensiveness in his own voice. "Stuart, and we know that," Megan said quickly, "but other people don't. And frankly, Edward, your behavior has been obsessive. You've cancelled important meetings. You're spending time and money on people you barely know." Robert leaned forward. "Edward, I've been informed that CPS is already investigating the situation. If they determine the child is being neglected or is at risk, they can remove her from her current environment. And if your name is involved in that, they'll investigate you too," Megan finished. "And when the media gets a hold of this story, a millionaire involved in a CPS case, our reputation will be destroyed." Edward stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The city stretched out before him, full of people living their safe, predictable lives, oblivious to the silent tragedies happening on their peripheries. "Oh, are you suggesting I abandon a child who needs help because of appearances?" he asked, not turning around. "We're suggesting you be smart," Robert replied. "There are appropriate ways to help children in need. Donations to established institutions, supervised charity programs. You don't have to get personally involved." "But I want to be personally involved," Edward said, finally turning to face them. "This girl, there's something special about her. A purity, a courage I don't see in adults. She taught me things about value and dignity that I had forgotten." Megan and Robert exchanged a look, and Edward realized they had already decided he was acting irrationally. "Edward," Megan said with the forced patience one uses with a stubborn child, "you're going through some kind of midlife crisis. It's understandable. Men your age often question their priorities. But you can't risk everything we've built because of an emotional impulse." His sister's words hit him like fists. She had reduced his connection with Lily to a midlife crisis, as if his genuine feelings were symptoms of an illness that needed to be cured. "Get out of my office," he said, his voice low but filled with restrained fury. "Edward," Robert began. "Get out," Edward repeated, louder this time. "And Megan, if I find out you were the one who reported Lily to CPS, our family relationship ends here." Megan turned pale. "Edward, I was just trying to protect our family. Lily is a 6-year-old child fighting for survival every day," Edward said, his voice trembling with emotion, "and you're treating her like a threat to our business. That says more about you than it does about me." After they left, Edward was alone in his office, facing the reality that his own family had become an obstacle in his efforts to help Lily. He realized the battle he was fighting was not just against poverty or bureaucracy, but against a value system that prioritized appearances and profits over human compassion. His determination, far from waning, intensified. If his family wanted a war, he was prepared to fight. Lily had risked her safety to protect his property. Now it was his turn to risk everything to protect her future. That night, Edward made a decision that would irrevocably change the course of his life. He would not let Megan, Robert, or anyone else dictate how he should exercise his humanity. Lily had reawakened a part of his soul he thought he had lost, and he would not let external forces suffocate it again. The war had begun, and Edward Miles was determined to win, even if it cost him everything he had built. Edward woke on a grey Tuesday with a strange sense of urgency. He had dreamed of Lily during the night, a nightmare where she reached out with her small hands, pleading for help while a crowd of people in suits tried to drag her away. He glanced at the clock, 6 in the morning. Normally, he would wake at 7, but something compelled him to get up and go check on Lily and Rose. When he arrived at the shack, he found a scene that made his heart stop. Rose was unconscious in bed, her breathing shallow and labored, while Lily, still in her pajamas, was desperately trying to wake her. "Mr. Ed!" Lily cried when she saw him, tears streaming down her face. "Grandma won't wake up. She was coughing up blood all night, and this morning I tried to give her medicine, but she won't answer." Edward knelt beside the bed, checking Rose's pulse. It was faint and irregular. Her skin had an alarming pallor, and she was running a high fever. It was obvious she needed immediate hospitalization. "Lily, we're taking your grandma to the hospital now," he said, already pulling his phone from his pocket to call 911. "That won't be necessary," a voice said from behind them. Edward turned to see 3 people standing in the doorway, 2 social workers, a middle-aged woman in formal attire, and a young man with a clipboard, and a police officer. Who are you?" Edward demanded, instinctively placing himself between Lily and the unexpected visitors. "I'm Amanda Fisher, Child Protective Services," the woman said, showing an ID badge. "This is my colleague, Carl, and this is Officer Rodriguez. We're here in response to a report of child neglect and an at-risk situation." "Neglect?" Edward stood up, his voice thick with indignation. "This child is caring for her sick grandmother with more dedication than many adults show their own families." "Sir, are you Edward Miles?" Carl asked, consulting his clipboard. "I am." Amanda exchanged a significant look with her colleague. "Mr. Miles, we've received information that you've been developing an inappropriate relationship with this minor. And now we find the child alone with an unconscious adult in completely inadequate living conditions." "Inappropriate relationship?" Edward's voice rose an octave. "I'm trying to help a child who is fighting for her life." "Mr. Ed is helping me," Lily said, her voice small but firm. "He brought a doctor for Grandma. He brought food when we didn't have any. He never did anything bad." Amanda completely ignored Lily's words, as if she were invisible. "Mr. Miles, you have no familial relation to this child, correct?" "No, but—" "And you are single, with no children. That has no relevance." "It's highly relevant," Amanda interrupted. "A grown man developing a sudden interest in a vulnerable child, spending money on her, visiting her regularly. It raises serious questions." Edward felt a hot rage build inside him. "Serious questions? You want to know what a serious question is? A 6-year-old child having to work to buy medicine for her grandmother, a little girl going to bed hungry because she has no money for food. Those are serious questions." "Mr. Miles," the police officer said, stepping forward, "I'm going to have to ask you to calm down." "I will not calm down," Edward exploded. "While you're here questioning my motives. This woman is dying and this child is desperate." It was then that something happened that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Rose began to have violent seizures on the bed, her body convulsing frighteningly. Lily screamed and rushed to her grandmother's side, trying to hold her. "Call an ambulance!" Edward shouted. "One is already on its way," Carl said, checking his phone. But Mr. Miles, regardless of the grandmother's state, "This child cannot remain in this environment. We're taking her to a temporary shelter until we can resolve the situation." "No!" Lily shrieked, clinging to Edward's arm. "I don't want to go. I want to stay with Grandma. I want to stay with Mr. Ed." "Lily, don't worry," Edward said, kneeling beside her. "I'm going to fix this. I won't let anyone separate you." Amanda approached with an expression that mixed professional determination with something that looked like personal satisfaction. "Mr. Miles, you have no legal authority over this child, and frankly, your insistence on maintaining contact with her is reinforcing our suspicions about your true intentions." The implied accusation hit Edward like a physical blow. He realized he was being deliberately painted as a predator, that his kindness was being twisted into something sordid and criminal. "My intentions," he said, his voice shaking with anger and pain. "My intentions were to give a shred of dignity to a child who has never known anything but struggle and deprivation." The ambulance arrived at that moment, along with 2 more police officers. The ensuing confusion was chaotic, paramedics trying to stabilize Rose, social workers insisting on taking Lily, police officers trying to maintain order, and at the center of it all, a 6-year-old girl screaming for her grandmother and for the only adult who had shown her kindness. "Please," Edward begged Amanda, "at least let me go with Lily. She's terrified." "Impossible," Amanda replied coldly. "You're part of the problem, not the solution." As they led Lily away, she reached for Edward, her tears breaking his heart. "Mr. Ed, don't leave me." "You promised you wouldn't leave me." Edward tried to follow them, but was blocked by the police officers. He watched, helpless, as they put Lily in the CPS car. Through the rear window, he could see her face, contorted by despair and the feeling of abandonment. In that moment, Edward Miles made the most radical decision of his life. He would not submit to a system that treated kindness as suspicion and compassion as a crime. If they wanted a fight, he would give them one. But first, he had to save Rose, because he knew that losing her grandmother would destroy Lily completely. The war Megan had predicted had finally begun, but not in the way she had expected. Edward wasn't just fighting his family or social prejudice. He was fighting an entire system that seemed designed to punish humanity and reward indifference. And he was willing to lose everything to win this battle. Edward spent the next 48 hours in a state of frenzied activity that bordered on obsession. First, he followed the ambulance to County General Hospital, where Rose was admitted to the ICU in critical condition. The doctors were clear: severe pneumonia complicated by malnutrition and a lack of proper treatment. Without immediate intervention, she would not survive. The problem was that, without proper identification or health insurance, Rose was only receiving the basic treatment offered by the overwhelmed public system. Edward tried to have her transferred to a private hospital, but ran into a wall of merciless bureaucracy that demanded documentation that simply didn't exist. "Doctor, I'll pay any amount," Edward said to Dr. Alcott, the medical director of St. Luke's Medical Center, one of the best hospitals in the city. "She needs intensive care immediately." "Mr. Miles, I understand your concern," Dr. Alcott, an elegant man with graying hair, replied, "but our hospital has strict protocols. Without proper patient documentation, without a legally recognized next of kin, we cannot accept the transfer." "But she'll die in the public hospital." "That is not our responsibility," the director said, his professional coldness cutting like a blade. I suggest you work on regularizing the patient's legal status through the proper channels." Simultaneously, Edward was fighting another battle to find out where Lily had been taken. CPS refused to provide any information, citing confidentiality. His lawyers informed him that, since he had no legal relationship with the child, he had no right to know her location or condition. "Edward, you need to understand," Robert Shaw said during a tense meeting in his office. "The system is working exactly as it's supposed to. A child in an at-risk situation was removed from an inadequate environment and placed under the protection of the state." Protection? Edward slammed his fist on the table. She was torn away from the only family she knows, separated from a dying grandmother and put with strangers. How is that protection? Robert sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Edward, your emotional connection to this situation is preventing you from seeing the reality. The child had no documents, lived in subhuman conditions, and was being forced to work. CPS acted correctly, and my attempts to help were completely ignored." "Your attempts to help," Robert said carefully, "were viewed as problematic. A single man developing an intense interest in a vulnerable child. Edward, you must understand how that looks to other people." The implication in Robert's words made Edward nauseous. "Do you also believe my motives are inappropriate?" Robert was silent for a moment too long. "Edward, I've known you for 20 years. I know you're a man of integrity, but what I believe doesn't matter. What matters is how the system interprets your actions." Edward left the lawyer's office feeling more alone than he had ever felt. Even people who knew him intimately were questioning his motives, reducing his genuine compassion to something suspicious and potentially criminal. His third battle was against his own family. Megan had called an emergency meeting of the family board, claiming that Edward's actions were damaging the company's reputation and jeopardizing important deals. "Edward, you've cancelled 3 major meetings this week," Megan said, her voice filled with exasperation. "The Japanese investors are questioning whether you're still focused on the business. And now there are rumors circulating about your involvement with CPS and investigations." "Rumors you helped spread," Edward retorted. "I protected our family by doing what was necessary," Megan replied without a shred of remorse, "and I'll continue to protect it. If you can't see that you're self-destructing over an irrational fixation..." "Irrational fixation." Edward stood up abruptly. "Megan, there is a 6-year-old child terrified in some shelter, separated from her dying grandmother. How can you call my concern irrational?" "Because there are thousands of children in similar situations," Megan exploded. "Why does this specific child command so much of your interest? Why are you willing to risk everything we've built for a stranger?" The question echoed in the silence of the boardroom. Edward realized he couldn't explain to Megan, or perhaps even to himself, why Lily had touched his heart so profoundly. There was something in the purity of her gratitude, in the courage with which she faced adversity, in the way she had tried to protect his car despite being a fragile child. Lily had awakened a humanity in him that he thought he had lost. "Because she taught me something I had forgotten," Edward said finally. "She taught me that pure goodness still exists in the world, and that it's worth fighting for." Megan shook her head sadly. "Edward, you're having a midlife crisis and projecting your feelings onto a child who can't possibly reciprocate or properly understand your attention. This isn't healthy for either of you." That night, Edward returned to his empty, luxurious penthouse, but it felt like a prison. The glass walls that usually gave him a sense of power and control now seemed only to highlight his powerlessness to help the people who needed him most. He stayed up late, staring out at the illuminated city, thinking of Lily. Where was she sleeping? Was she scared? Was she crying for her grandmother? Had anyone explained to her what was happening? Or had she simply woken up one day to find that everyone she loved had vanished from her life? Around 3 in the morning, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He would not wait for the system to change or for his family to understand. He would use every resource at his disposal, spend his entire fortune if necessary, and find a way to reunite Lily with Rose, even if it meant confronting every institution, every law, and every prejudice that stood in his way. The war had escalated, but Edward Miles was just beginning to fight. Edward hired 3 private investigators to locate Lily and find out exactly where she was being held. What they discovered left him in a state of shock. Lily had been placed in the Northwood Children's Shelter, an overcrowded institution on the outskirts of the city, notorious for its poor conditions and lack of adequate resources. "Mr. Miles," reported Marina Sands, the lead investigator, "I've managed to get some troubling information about the shelter. They're at more than double their capacity. Many children are sleeping on mattresses on the floor, and there are only 2 staff members to supervise 43 kids." Edward's stomach churned. "And Lily, how is she?" "According to our sources, she isn't adjusting well. She cried for 3 straight days, refuses to eat properly, and has been having constant nightmares. She keeps asking about her grandmother and about a Mr. Ed." The words pierced Edward like knives. The image of Lily, scared and helpless in a hostile environment, made him clench his fists until his nails dug into his palms. "There's more," Marina continued, hesitating. "We've confirmed that the tip that led to Lily's removal was made by someone close to you. Someone who provided specific details about your visits and the money you spent on the child." Edward didn't need to ask who it was. The confirmation that Megan had deliberately sabotaged his efforts to help Lily filled him with a cold, calculated anger. Meanwhile, his battle to save Rose took an unexpected turn. Dr. Henry Morgan called him urgently for a meeting that would change his perspective on the entire situation. "Edward, I need to tell you something about County General Hospital," the doctor said, his expression grave. "I did some digging into the treatment Rose is receiving, and I discovered something very disturbing." "What?" Edward asked, already dreading the answer. "The medications she should be receiving to fight the infection. They were suspended yesterday. When I questioned it, I was told it was an administrative decision due to budgetary limitations." Edward was silent for a moment, processing the information. "Are you telling me they're deliberately letting her die?" "Not deliberately," Dr. Morgan corrected, "but there are pressures. I found out that someone with significant influence made calls to the hospital, suggesting that limited resources shouldn't be spent on hopeless social cases." The realization hit Edward like a tsunami. "Megan," he whispered. "I can't confirm it," Dr. Morgan said carefully. "But the description of the person who made the calls matches your sister and the words she used. Social cases that just drain resources with no benefit to taxpayers. It sounds very much like her rhetoric." Edward felt something break inside his chest. His own sister had not only torn Lily from her family, but was now actively sabotaging Rose's medical treatment. She was using the family's influence to ensure an innocent woman died, all to prove her point about Edward's inappropriate involvement. "Doctor, is there anything I can do? Technically, you could become Rose's legal guardian, assume all medical expenses, and have her transferred to a private hospital. But that would require documentation she doesn't have. And what if I get that documentation?" Dr. Morgan looked at him, surprised. "How?" Edward had reached a point where conventional legal considerations seemed irrelevant in the face of the situation's moral urgency. "Leave that to me." That afternoon, Edward did something he never thought he would. He sought out Peter Kane, a lawyer known for working in the gray areas of the law to get documentation for people who were invisible to the system. "Miles, I've heard about your case," Kane said. A thin man in his 40s with piercing eyes. "Very interesting. A millionaire developing a social conscience." "I'm not interested in your opinion," Edward said coldly. "I want to know if you can get legal documents for a woman who is dying in the hospital." "I can," Kane replied without hesitation. "It will be expensive, it will take a few days, and it will technically violate several bureaucratic statutes. Are you prepared for the consequences?" Edward thought of Lily crying in the shelter, of Rose being left to die, of his family using their influence to destroy innocent lives. "I'm prepared for anything." "Good, But there's one condition. Once we start this process, there's no turning back. You will be officially responsible for this woman and her granddaughter. If anything goes wrong, your reputation and your freedom will be on the line. I accept. While Kane began the process of creating a legal identity for Rose, Edward made another radical decision. He scheduled a meeting with Amanda Fisher, the social worker, determined to confront the system directly. "Mr. Miles," Amanda said when he appeared at the CPS office, "you shouldn't be here. We've already explained that you have no legal rights regarding the minor." "I want to see Lily," Edward said without preamble. "Impossible. You are considered a potentially harmful influence on the child's development." "Harmful?" Edward struggled to keep his voice level. "I am the only person who has shown her genuine kindness in her entire life. You are a single man who developed a fixation on a vulnerable child," Amanda replied, her voice professionally cold. "Our protocol is clear in these situations." "Protocol?" Edward repeated with bitterness. "Do you have a protocol for a child who is withering from sadness? A protocol for separating a girl from her dying grandmother? A protocol for destroying the only family a child has ever known?" "We have a protocol to protect children from adults with questionable motives," Amanda retorted. Edward realized he was fighting against a wall of institutionalized prejudice that turned compassion into suspicion and kindness into a crime. But he wouldn't give up. Lily had risked her safety to protect him. Now it was his turn to risk everything to protect her. The war was far from over, and Edward was willing to escalate the conflict to levels he had never even imagined. 3 weeks after Lily was taken to the shelter, Edward received a call that would completely change the course of his battle. It was from Marina Sands, his private investigator, and the urgent tone of her voice made his heart race. "Mr. Miles, you need to come to the shelter immediately," she said. Lily ran away. Edward dropped everything and ran to his car. During the drive to the Northwood Children's Shelter, his mind was flooded with terrible scenarios. A 6-year-old child alone on the streets of a big city, with no money, knowing no one, desperately searching for her grandmother or for him. At the shelter, the director, a stern woman named Sonia Carver, greeted Edward with obvious hostility. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "We've already explained that you have no rights over the minor." "When did she run away?" Edward asked, ignoring the hostility. "This morning, during breakfast. She took advantage of the staff being distracted and simply vanished." Sonia paused, studying Edward's face. "She spent the last 3 weeks talking constantly about a Mr. Ed and her grandmother. Perhaps you know where she went." Edward felt a mix of pride and terror. Lily had been brave enough to flee a situation that terrified her, but now she was in even greater danger. "She probably went to the hospital," Edward said. "To look for her grandmother?" "We've already sent people to check," Sonia replied. "She hasn't been seen there." Edward spent the next few hours driving to every place Lily might have gone. The hospital, the bakery where they met, the streets where she used to sell flowers, the abandoned shack where they had lived. Nothing. It was as if she had simply disappeared. It was when he was returning to his high-rise, exhausted and desperate, that he saw her. Lily was sitting on the sidewalk in front of his office building, her clothes dirty and torn, clearly having slept on the street. When she saw him, her eyes filled with tears of relief. "Mr. Ed," she cried, running toward him. "I knew you'd come here. I waited so long." Edward knelt and hugged her, feeling her small body tremble against his. She was thinner than when he had last seen her, and there were scratches on her arms and face. "Lily, my darling, are you okay?" he asked, examining her injuries. "I ran away from the bad place," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "They were mean to me. They wouldn't let me see Grandma. They wouldn't let me talk about you. I tried to be good, but they said Grandma was going to die and that I'd never see you again." The words broke Edward's heart. "No one is ever going to separate us again," he promised, though he had no idea how he would keep that promise. "Mr. Eddie," Lily said, pulling back to look him in the eyes. Is Grandma really, really sick? They said she's going to die because of the expensive medicine. Edward realized he had to be honest with her. Grandma is very sick, yes, but I'm fighting to get her the best doctors and the best medicine. I can help, Lily said earnestly. I can sell more flowers, I can work more, I'll do anything to make Grandma better. The girl's determination humbled him. Here was a child willing to sacrifice everything for the person she loved, while his own family was actively sabotaging his efforts to save lives. Lily, let's go see Grandma now, Edward said, but after that, we might have to leave this city for a while. Leave? Where to? To a place where we can be together without bad people trying to tear us apart. In that moment, Edward made a decision that would change his life forever. He would no longer fight within a corrupt system that punished kindness. He would take Lily and Rose out of the city, find a place where they could live as a family, far from Megan's destructive influence and institutionalized prejudice. At the hospital, they discovered that Rose's condition had deteriorated significantly. Dr. Morgan met them in the hallway, his expression grim. Edward, I managed to get her transferred to a private room and started the proper treatment using the documents you provided, he said. But she's very weak. The next 48 hours will be critical. When they entered the room, Rose was conscious but visibly frail. Her eyes lit up when she saw Lily. My girl, she whispered, holding out a trembling hand. Where were you? I was so worried. Grandma, they took me to a bad place, Lily said, holding her grandmother's hand carefully. But Mr. Ed found me. He's going to take care of us. Rose looked at Edward with a mixture of gratitude and concern. Edward, sir, what's happening? The nurses said you're taking responsibility for us, but this is too much. Rose, Edward said, gently interrupting her, you and Lily have become my family, and I protect my family. Tears streamed down the elderly woman's face. But the consequences for you, your life, your business, none of that matters, Edward said, and he realized he was speaking with absolute sincerity. You two taught me something I had forgotten. You taught me there's something more important than money or social status. You taught me about real love. That night, as Lily slept in a chair beside Rose's bed, Edward finalized the arrangements to move them from the city. He had bought a house in a small town 200 miles away, where they could live in peace while Rose recovered. He knew he was abandoning everything he had built, that Megan would likely take control of the company, that his social reputation would be destroyed. But for the first time in years, Edward Miles felt truly free. The next morning brought the final test of his resolve. Megan appeared at the hospital accompanied by lawyers and social workers, prepared for a final battle for what she considered her brother's soul. Megan's entrance into the hospital room was like a military invasion. She was accompanied by Robert Shaw, Amanda Fisher, and 2 private security guards. Lily, who was helping Rose drink some water, instinctively shrank behind Edward when she saw the group enter. Edward, this ends now, Megan said, her voice laced with authority and contained fury. Do you have kidnapped a minor from the official shelter where she was being cared for? I didn't kidnap anyone, Edward replied calmly, placing himself protectively between Lily and the visitors. Lily ran away because she was being mistreated, and she came to find me. She's a traumatized child who is not capable of making decisions about her own well-being, Amanda Fisher interjected. Mr. Miles, you are severely obstructing our child protection work. Robert Shaw stepped forward with a folder of documents. Edward, I've brought papers for your voluntary psychiatric commitment. Your family is concerned about your mental stability. Psychiatric commitment. Edward felt a cold anger spread through his veins. You want to have me committed because I chose to help a child in need. You've abandoned your corporate responsibilities, Megan said, her mask of control beginning to slip. You've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on strangers, forged documents, removed a child from official protection. Edward, you have completely lost touch with reality. Mr. Ed isn't crazy, Lily suddenly shouted, her small but firm voice cutting through the tension in the room. He's the only good person I know. Child, be quiet, Amanda said sharply. The adults are talking. The way Amanda spoke to Lily made something snap inside Edward. Don't you talk to her like that, he said, his voice rising dangerously. You treat this child as if she's property, as if her feelings and opinions don't matter. She is a minor, Amanda retorted. It's not up to her to decide what's best for her life. And it's up to you, the people who put her in an overcrowded shelter where she cried for 3 weeks. The people who kept her from visiting her sick grandmother, the people who treat love and care as suspicious behavior. Rose, who had remained silent, watching the argument, tried to sit up in bed. Please, she said, her voice weak but determined. Stop fighting in front of my granddaughter. You are not her mother, Amanda said coldly. You have no legal authority to make decisions for the child. I raised Lily since the day she was born, Rose replied, tears of frustration streaming down her face. I love her more than my own life. Love doesn't replace the legal capacity for care, Robert said. You lived in inadequate conditions, without documentation, without a stable income. Because the system never gave us a chance to get documentation, Edward exploded. You've created a cycle where people without papers can't get jobs, and without jobs, they can't get papers. Megan stepped closer to him, lowering her voice to a more personal tone. Edward, don't you see what you're doing to yourself? You were a respected businessman, a leader in the community. Now you're seen as an unstable man obsessed with a poor child. And I'd rather be seen that way than as a person who ignores suffering because it's convenient, Edward replied. Suffering. Megan laughed bitterly. Edward, there are millions of children suffering in the world. Why is this specific child worth the destruction of everything you've built? The question echoed in the silent room. Edward looked at Lily, who was watching him with wide, trusting eyes, then at Rose, who was fighting illness but still found the strength to worry about her granddaughter. Because, Edward said slowly, this child taught me that there's something more important than a business empire or social approval. She taught me about courage, the courage to protect who you love, even when everyone is against you. She taught me about pure gratitude, about dignity in adversity, about unconditional love. He paused, looking at the skeptical expressions of those present. You see a problem child who needs to be controlled by the system. I see a little hero who risked her safety for a stranger, who has worked since she was small to care for her sick grandmother, who maintains hope and kindness even when the whole world seems to conspire against her. Very nice poetry, Megan said with sarcasm, but it doesn't change the fact that you're breaking the law. Then change the law, Edward said. Make a system that protects children without destroying families. Create policies that help people get out of poverty instead of punishing them for being poor. Amanda sighed impatiently. Mr. Miles, we're not here to philosophize about social reform. We're here to retrieve a child who is under our legal responsibility. She is not going back to that shelter, Edward said with absolute firmness. Then you will be arrested for kidnapping and obstruction of justice, Amanda replied, signaling for the security guards to approach. It was at that moment that Lily did something none of the adults expected. She ran to the center of the room and planted herself firmly between Edward and the guards, her small arms outstretched as if she could physically protect him. "Don't touch Mr. Ed," she cried, her voice trembling but determined. "He didn't do anything wrong. He was only good to me when no one else was." The room fell into absolute silence. Everyone present watched this 6-year-old child stand up to powerful adults with a courage that was humbling to witness. Please," Lily said, her voice now softer but just as firm, "don't take Mr. Ed away. He's my family now. I don't have anyone else." The tears that streamed down the girl's face were the catalyst for a change that no adult argument had managed to provoke. Even Amanda Fisher seemed shaken by the pure display of love and loyalty. The moment of final decision, which would determine all of their fates, had arrived. The silence in the hospital room was broken by Rose's weak but determined voice. "I want to speak," she said, trying to sit up fully in bed. "You're deciding my granddaughter's future as if she's an object, but no one has asked what I think." Amanda turned to her with barely disguised impatience. "Mom, you don't have the legal standing." "I have the standing of love," Rose interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "I raised Lily since she was born. I've seen every tear, every smile, every moment of courage from this extraordinary girl, and I'll tell you something." She looked directly at Amanda. In all these years of struggle, Edward was the first person who looked at Lily and saw a child who deserved dignity. She paused for breath, the effort clearly taking a toll. "You talk about protection, but where were you when Lily was going hungry? Where were you when she was working on the street to buy my medicine? Where were you when she was sleeping in the cold because we couldn't afford blankets?" Rose's words echoed in the room like accusations no one could refute. "Edward came into our lives like an angel," she continued. "He didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't judge our poverty. He just saw a child who needed help and he helped. And you turned that kindness into something dirty and suspicious." Megan approached the bed. "Mom, my brother is sick. His fixation on your granddaughter isn't natural or healthy." "Sick?" Rose laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Lady, what's sick is a society that punishes kindness and rewards indifference. Your brother has found his humanity, and you want to take that away from him." Robert Shaw tried to intervene. "Rose, we understand you're grateful, but you don't understand anything," Rose said, cutting him off. "You see numbers, procedures, protocols. I see a child who has finally found someone who truly loves her." It was then that something happened that completely shifted the dynamic. Lily, who had remained brave but silent after her display of courage, walked up to Amanda and did something no adult expected. "Mom," Lily said, her voice small but clear, "can I ask you a question?" Amanda, clearly taken aback by the child's direct approach, nodded hesitantly. "Do you have kids?" Lily asked. "I do. A daughter your age. And do you love her?" "Of course I do," Amanda replied, her professional defensiveness wavering slightly. "Then you get it," Lily said with devastating wisdom. "If your daughter was all alone and scared, with no one to take care of her, and someone good came along to help, wouldn't you want that person to take care of her?" Amanda was speechless for a moment. The pure simplicity of Lily's question had cut through all the bureaucratic justifications and reached the heart of the human issue. "Mr. Ed isn't a bad stranger," Lily continued. "He's my family. He gave me my first birthday cake ever. He brought a doctor for Grandma. He never hurt me, never was mean to me. He just loved me when nobody else did." The tears that began to well in Amanda's eyes were the first sign that the barriers were starting to crumble. "Why do you want to take me away from someone who's good to me?" Lily asked, her voice beginning to tremble. "Why do you want to put me in that bad place where nobody cares if I cry? Why is being loved a bad thing?" Edward watched in silence as Lily, without realizing it, did what he hadn't been able to do in weeks of legal arguments and confrontations. She was appealing to the basic humanity of the people in the room, reminding them that behind all the protocols and procedures was a real child with real feelings. Megan, however, was not emotionally swayed. "Edward," she said, her voice taking on a tone he recognized from childhood, the tone she used when she was about to deliver a final ultimatum. "You have a choice to make. You can come home with us now, get the psychological treatment you need, and resume your normal life. Or you can continue with this obsession and lose everything, your company, your social standing, your freedom." "And Lily?" Edward asked. "Lily will go back where she belongs, under proper professional care. Edward looked at Lily, who was watching him with eyes full of hope and fear. He looked at Rose, who was fighting death, but still found the strength to worry about her granddaughter. He looked at Megan, who represented everything he used to be: pragmatic, calculating, emotionally distant. "Megan," Edward said finally, "you're right about one thing. I do have a choice to make." He knelt beside the bed where Lily was sitting, taking her small hands in his. "Lily," he said, "if I could officially adopt you, if we could be a real family, would you like that?" The girl's eyes filled with tears of joy. "More than anything in the world," she whispered. Edward stood up and faced his sister. "Then my choice is made. I'd rather lose everything you consider important and keep everything that actually matters." "Edward, you don't know what you're saying," Robert said. "Without your resources, without your social standing, how will you care for a child?" "The same way Rose cared for her for 6 years," Edward replied, "with love, dedication, and the determination to make any sacrifice necessary." It was at that moment that the door to the room opened and a person no one expected walked in. Dr. Henry Morgan, accompanied by a younger man in a suit. "Pardon the interruption," Dr. Morgan said, "but there's something you all need to know. This is Andrew Costa, an attorney specializing in children's rights, and he has information that could completely change this situation." Andrew Costa introduced himself with the calm authority of someone accustomed to handling complex cases involving children's rights. "I'm a child protection attorney, and I was contacted by Dr. Morgan to examine this specific case," he said, opening a briefcase full of documents. "After a detailed investigation, I've discovered several serious irregularities in the procedures taken against Mr. Miles and the minor, Lily." Amanda Fisher stiffened. "What kind of irregularities?" "First," Costa said, consulting his papers, "the original complaint that led to the child's removal was filed by a person with a direct financial interest in harming Mr. Miles. This constitutes a malicious complaint and procedural bad faith." Megan turned pale, but kept a controlled expression. "Second," the lawyer continued, "the child was removed without a proper assessment of her actual at-risk situation. The reports I managed to access show that Lily was well cared for, well fed, and showed no signs of abuse or neglect. She was living in precarious conditions," Amanda protested. "Precarious economic conditions do not, in themselves, constitute grounds for family removal," Costa replied firmly. "Especially when there's evidence that the situation was being actively improved through the help of Mr. Miles." Edward felt a spark of hope grow in his chest. "Third," Costa said, his voice taking on a sterner tone, "there is evidence that information about Mr. Miles was deliberately distorted to create a negative impression. Someone with privileged access spread rumors about his motivations, severely damaging his reputation without a factual basis." All heads turned to Megan, who finally lost her composure. "I was protecting my brother from a situation that could destroy him." "Destroy him how?" Costa asked. "By helping a child in need, by providing medical care for a sick person, by demonstrating human compassion. He abandoned his responsibilities," Megan exploded. "He spent a fortune on strangers. He completely lost his mind." "Ma'am," Costa said calmly, "after reviewing the financial records Mr. Miles authorized me to examine, I found that he spent less helping this family in 1 month than he normally spends on entertainment in a week. It hardly constitutes spending a fortune." Rose, who had been following the conversation with growing hope, addressed Costa. "Doctor, does this mean Lily can stay with Edward?" "More than that," the lawyer replied. "No, I found that there is legal precedent for what we call de facto parentage, in cases where a child develops genuine family bonds with a non-relative. The court's primary standard is the best interest of the child, and in this case, a strong argument can be made." Amanda protested. "But he's single. He has no experience with children. Thousands of single parents adopt children every year," Costa interrupted. And as for experience, it's interesting to note that Lily showed significant improvement in her emotional and physical well-being during the period she was under Mr. Miles's care. Edward could hardly believe what he was hearing. Mr. Costa, are you saying it's possible for me to legally adopt Lily? More than possible, the lawyer replied. Given the irregularities in the removal process, the clear evidence of an emotional bond between you, and the willingness of the current legal guardian, he looked at Rose, to transfer custody, I'd say it's probable. Rose struggled to sit up completely. Doctor, I want Edward to adopt my Lily. He will give her everything I never could, education, security, opportunity, but most of all, he will give her love. Lily, who had followed the conversation with wide eyes, finally found her voice. Does that mean I can be Mr. Ed's daughter for real? It means exactly that, Costa said, smiling at her. If that's what you all want. The tears that streamed down Lily's face were of pure joy. She threw herself into Edward's arms, and he held her as if he would never let go. Robert Shaw, who had remained silent during Costa's explanation, finally spoke. And what about the legal consequences of Edward's actions? The forged documents, the unauthorized removal of the child from the shelter? Costa consulted his papers again. Considering the documents were created to save a person's life, that the child's removal was technically a family reunification since she voluntarily sought out Mr. Miles, and that there's evidence of bad faith on the part of the original complainants, it's unlikely any criminal charges would stick. Megan, realizing she had completely lost the battle, made one last desperate attempt. Edward, even if you manage to adopt this child, what happens to our company, to our family? Edward looked at his sister with a mixture of sadness and determination. Megan, you can have the company. You can have our entire family inheritance. What I've discovered is that family isn't about blood or money. It's about love, protection, and mutual sacrifice. He hugged Lily tighter. And I already have the family I want. Dr. Morgan, who had watched the whole scene in silence, approached Rose's bed. And what about you, ma'am? How are you feeling? For the first time in months, Rose said, her face lit by a radiant smile. I feel healed, not physically, not yet, but in my heart. Seeing my Lily find a real family, that's worth more than any medicine. Amanda Fisher, who had remained quiet for most of Costa's explanation, finally spoke. Mr. Costa, if the adoption process is approved, what happens with the shelter? We have protocols. Protocols exist to protect children, Costa replied. When a child finds a loving family that can properly care for her, the correct protocol is to facilitate that union, not to impede it. He paused, looking directly at Amanda. Mrs. Fisher, may I suggest that this case be used as an example of how the system ought to function when it works correctly? A child in need was helped by a compassionate individual, who in turn was supported by the medical and legal community to formalize that relationship of care. Edward realized it wasn't just his life that had changed. Lily had taught everyone in the room, even those who had initially opposed him, about the transformative power of genuine love and unconditional protection. The little girl who had timidly entered a bakery, asking only to blow out a candle, had just won a family hour, a new life, and had shown a room full of adults what true courage and love really meant. 6 months after that meeting in the bakery changed their lives forever, Edward stood at the door of the same Sweet Haven bakery, watching Lily through the window. But this time, the scene was completely different. Lily was sitting at one of the tables, wearing an immaculate school uniform, her hair in neat pigtails, concentrating on her math homework. Edward smiled as he watched her bite the end of her pencil when she was thinking, a habit she'd developed in the last few weeks since starting school. At 7, They had discovered she was a year older than they thought. Once they finally got her proper documents, Lily was adapting to school life with the same fierce determination she had shown in every other situation. "Dad!" she yelled when she saw him enter, using the word that still made Edward's heart skip a beat every time he heard it. "I finished my math problems. My teacher said I'm the best in the class." Edward sat beside her, examining the notebook filled with numbers and calculations written in the careful handwriting of a child who took her studies very seriously. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," he said, kissing the top of her head. The adoption process had been finalized 3 months earlier. In a simple but emotional ceremony at the courthouse, Edward remembered how Lily had held his hand tightly as the judge officially declared her to be, legally and officially, Lily Miles, his daughter. "Dad," Lily said, putting her notebook in her new school backpack, "can we visit Grandma Rose today? I want to show her the gold stars I got at school this week." "Of course we can," Edward replied. "She's waiting for us." Rose had made a full recovery from pneumonia. Thanks to the intensive treatment Edward had provided, she now lived in a comfortable house a few blocks from Edward and Lily's home, officially employed as a family care consultant, a position Edward had created specifically to ensure she would always be a part of Lily's life with dignity and financial independence. When they arrived at Rose's house, she greeted them at the door with a radiant smile and open arms. At 62, she looked like a completely different person from the frail, sick woman Edward had met in that shack months before. Her hair, now well kept and silver, was tied in an elegant bun, and her simple but new clothes reflected the dignity she had always possessed inside. "My princess," she said, hugging Lily. "How was school today?" "Grandma, look," Lily said, pulling a sheet of paper from her backpack. "I got 5 gold stars this week. 1 in math, 1 in reading, 1 in science, and 1 for helping my classmates, and 1 for good behavior." Rose examined the paper with a true grandmother's pride. "My goodness, how smart! Edward, are you seeing this?" "I'm seeing it," Edward replied, feeling a familiar wave of emotion. "Our Lily is truly special." "Edward," Rose said, as Lily ran into the backyard to play with the dog they had adopted, a loving mutt named Bingo. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" They sat on the porch, watching Lily play in the garden. The child laughed as she chased Bingo, her clear, joyful laughter echoing through the afternoon air. It was impossible to imagine this was the same girl who, months before, had carried the weight of the world on her small shoulders. "Edward," Rose said, "I want you to know that what you did for us, there are no words to thank you." "Rose, you don't have to thank me," Edward replied. "You two changed my life as much as I changed yours." "No, listen," she said, gently touching his arm. "Before you came along, I was dying, not just physically, but inside. I watched my Lily lose her childhood, taking on responsibilities no child should have. I knew that when I passed, she would be completely alone in the world." She paused, watching Lily teach Bingo to sit. "Now I look at her and I see a real child. I see dreams in her eyes. I see hope. I see a future. She talks about becoming a doctor when she grows up, to help other people like you helped us." Rose's words touched Edward deeply. "She can be anything she wants to be," he said. "I'll make sure she has every opportunity she deserves." "I know you will," Rose said, smiling. "And I want you to know that, no matter what your family said, you are the father Lily always needed, not because you have money or can give her material things, but because you truly love her." Just then, Lily ran up to them, Bingo trailing behind. "Dad, Grandma, how about we go to the bakery for some ice cream to celebrate my gold stars?" Edward smiled, remembering how it had all started in that very place. "Great idea, sweetheart." At the bakery, they sat at the same table where Edward had been on that cold winter morning. The baker, who now knew them well, personally brought over the ice cream, strawberry for Lily, chocolate for Rose, and vanilla for Edward. "You know," Lily said, savoring her ice cream. "Sometimes I think about that day when I came in here asking to blow out a candle. It feels like a different lifetime." "It was a different lifetime," Edward said. "We started a new life that day." "Dad," Lily said, her eyes shining with curiosity, "do you think other kids like me, who don't have a family, can find moms and dads like you?" Edward thought about the question carefully. In the past few months, he had used a portion of his fortune to create a foundation dedicated to helping vulnerable children find loving families. They had already facilitated 6 successful adoptions. "I believe so," he said. "In fact, our foundation is helping other children find families, and who knows, maybe one day you'll want to help with that too." "I do," Lily said with enthusiasm. "I want to help other kids find families like ours." Rose watched the conversation with tears of joy in her eyes. "You two are proof that miracles happen," she said. As they left the bakery, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Edward held Lily's hand as they walked home, with Rose on the girl's other side. They formed an unconventional family, bound not by blood, but by love, mutual protection, and the conscious choice to care for one another. "Dad," Lily said as they walked, "do you remember my wish on that first birthday cake?" "I do," Edward said. "You wished you wouldn't be hungry anymore and for Grandma to get better." "Yeah," Lily said, smiling, "and they both came true. But do you know what my new birthday wish is?" "What?" "That our family stays together always, and that we can help lots of other kids find the love I found." Edward stopped walking and knelt to Lily's level, looking into the eyes of the girl who had transformed his life. "That wish," he said, "I promise, will come true." As they continued walking home, Edward reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. A cold winter morning, a brave little girl, a simple wish, and an act of kindness had combined to create something greater than any of them could have imagined. Lily had taught Edward that true wealth wasn't in material possessions or social status, but in the courage to open one's heart to unconditional love. She had shown that even a small child can have extraordinary strength, and that sometimes the most unlikely encounters can lead to the most profound transformations. The bakery where it all began would always be there, serving cakes and sweets to the community. But for Edward, Lily, and Rose, it would forever represent the place where a family was born, where kindness triumphed over indifference, and where a brave little girl taught a powerful man the true meaning of the word home.